Beth, you and I met for the first time, I think,
Monday.
2 days, I don't even know what day it is, so 2 or 3 days ago now. And you said something to me, which you said when you were introducing yourself, you said, I'm not an expert, rather I'm a UDL enthusiast and learner advocate. Now, given you were about to speak to a room full of 900 educators, that was a bit of an odd thing to say, was it not?
Yeah, I have to admit, I was correcting you. You said, Beth, you're the UDL expert. And so I just wanted to make sure that regardless of the audience, that I put myself in the position of being a learner and a learner advocate for sure. And I'm a UDL enthusiast, which means that it's an acronym that holds a lot of weight with me. And I was lucky enough to share my enthusiasm with 900 wonderful participants on Monday. That was an exciting feat for sure. It was wonderful.
And the learner advocate part of it, what did you mean by that?
Well, of course, I'm an educator at heart, but I definitely see myself as one of the educators in the mix that's really always working to support learners who are oftentimes marginalized and end up on the edges outside of the middle of the bell curve. And I think that just means I have a lot of intentionality, and I'm always trying to think about how to take a closer look at the systems that are keeping them there.
I mean, I'm gonna ask you some questions about your career and
sure.
But I mean, was teaching something that was always on the cards for Beth?
I come from a family of educators, so it was always in the air for sure. I definitely considered different careers at different points of my teenage life and my early adulthood. I considered getting an MBA. I considered going into international marketing, and I definitely thought about becoming a psychologist. And gratefully, I chose to become an educator, which is just meant I needed to do some wondering and come back to my original plan, which was to be a teacher.
Yeah. There's somebody who does work with ESF, the organization I work for. And we had a fascinating conversation one time about teaching and education. And he was trying to draw a distinction between a calling and a dream. And he said a dream is something that's aspirational. And when it becomes a calling, it's almost burdensome. It's something that you absolutely have to do. Is that something you recognize?
I've never heard it put in those terms, but I'm in that camp. Definitely. Yeah. And I was one of those teachers who had a really hard time also turning it off. And and really letting go of the idea that things could be better, and how can I make sure that the next week's plans are going to really deliver for the learners.
Okay.
So
I mean, let's get into it, because your career path is very interesting. Starting in Chicago, I think, the suburbs of Chicago.
I was born and raised in the suburbs of Chicago, and there is not very glamorous. I just want to be clear. Nothing glamorous about it.
Well, it sounds pretty glamorous. But you went on this journey that eventually took you to Dresden in Germany, and now around the world as a consultant. So
yeah.
Tell us not just about what you did, but what did you learn along the way in this sort of interesting path that you've taken?
Yeah, I grew up in Suburbia, and I'm really grateful for the opportunities that I had, but it was pretty boring. And I always knew that there was another world out there, and so goes the cliche. But I think as a teacher working in the public school system in the U.S., I quickly realized that I wasn't going to endure, that I wasn't going to last. And I always wanted to travel. And actually, the first time I traveled abroad was when I was a foreign exchange student in high school. And I lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil for a year. And I would have to say that after that year, I always knew that at some point in my adult life, I would end up living outside of the U.S. So I'm like a lot of international educators. I let go of my lease and put my cat in a cat carrier and had 8 duffel bags worth of my worldly possessions and hopped on a plane and took a position, which was in Germany.
And that that I suppose is quite unusual, because a lot of people would take their first step on an international sort of teaching engagement in a country that might sort of English as a first language, or quite a strong, or you would think there'd be a very, you know, countries with lots of expats, whereas Germany's not something that immediately springs to mind, that, you know, you're going to be surrounded by, you know, people who speak this, whose first language is the same as yours.
Well, I saw German as a challenge. I had already had a lot of practice speaking Portuguese. I'm really actually passionate about learning Spanish. But I also knew that beyond just learning a new language, it was a cool opportunity, because I was going to be in the middle of Europe. And at the time, I was like, wow, I can travel all over Europe during my vacations and really have a great time. And I just saw it as a wealth of opportunities. So I think at the time when I decided to move abroad, I didn't think very, I think I was just young and free and really reveling in my own independence. I admire the people who bring their whole families abroad. That's a whole different set of rules.
Yeah.
But that wasn't me at the time. It was just me and my cat.
Just you and your cat. Look, we'll talk about what you taught in a second, but I read something that you wrote, and I think it was obviously during the pandemic, and you talked about the having to unlearn, you know, all of the things that you learn as an educator in the US, and being confronted by the IB and just that different approach.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm just having a moment right now. Thank you for reading that piece. Yeah, I wrote that many years ago. I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, there was a lot going on during that time. My kids were really little, and I was just trying to figure out life during the pandemic. But I think I was experiencing what many people were experiencing, was the time and space to reflect. I think that was the gift that a lot of us were given during the pandemic. And it was actually a turning point for me in my professional life, because I saw that there were going to be shifts in the world of international education that were going to take place that would never be undone, or at least I hoped.
Yeah.
And I was, at the time, and I still count myself as a true IB enthusiast, but I also see that, you know, within those systems, there are some quirks and some limitations, especially within the current structure of the diploma program. And I just had a lot of time to reflect on all of the learners that I had supported throughout the years and the struggles that they had faced, going through, you know, the PYP and the MYP, and then entering or perhaps not entering into the diploma program, and how over time learners with challenges and unique learning profiles became more and more vulnerable in a system that was designed to actually build their confidence and self-awareness. Yep. And it was those students, because I was a learning support coordinator at the time, it was those students that were really my calling. Really helping me to tap into my advocacy for all learners, but especially for them.
Yeah. I mean, let's rewind just a little bit. So early in your career, one of the areas that you specialized in was working with kids, students who were either blind or visually impaired. Was that your first venture into working with kids with specific needs, or did you have a background with that before?
Oh, that's an interesting question. That was technically my first professional position, and that's what I chose to study. But actually, my first paid job was as a babysitter. When I was 12 years old, I crossed the street. There was a brand new family that moved into town. And I went up to their door, knocked on it, rang the bell, and said, "Hey, I'm Beth, and I would like to be your babysitter." I saw the toys in the yard. And the lovely woman who came to the door with a little toddler at her feet and a baby in her arms was a woman by the name of Maureen, and that toddler, Claudia, and the little boy was Nico. And it was a family who began a journey that many families begin kind of just trying to figure things out and make clear why it was that one of their children didn't seem to be developing in normal ways. And then those questions lead to answers, but more questions.
Yep.
And I grew close with that family and close with both of the children and followed them along on their journey as a family with a member who was on the spectrum with autism spectrum disorder. So from the age of 12, I have, I've walked alongside and had a really interesting and enriching view of what it's like to be a family with a child with a developmental disability.
And I presume at that point, the diagnosis for autism and various other conditions was not as well advanced and well integrated into the work of schools as perhaps it is now?
Definitely not. That was also interesting because I was just like, a preteen and a teenager and watching him get early intervention services. I have to say that was a unique situation because the family was quite well resourced. So they actually paid for a lot of specialized supports and interventions. But the story is very much the same these days. We have a system that is designed for students who are in the middle of the bell curve. We pride ourselves on providing specialized services for those who are perceived as having needs, or there's a diagnosis that follows them that says, yes, they need this. And then we try our best to honor what we are able to provide. But there's so many questions around belonging, around what it means to learn and the social aspects of learning, how oftentimes students with special needs, students with unique learning profiles are sometimes marginalized or used as inspiration for those around them. So I would love to say that in 2025, we've made tons of progress. And certainly within the medical model of quote unquote diagnosing a condition that I would argue isn't a disorder. I think a lot of people would say we've made a lot of progress, but I think we're ready to start really challenging and questioning what the medical model means within schools.
Yeah.
Because I typically lean on the medical model to deal with sickness and preventative care. But when you're talking about a young person, a child who knows no better and really wants to be seen for all that makes them unique, they want to feel a sense of connection and belonging. And when they walk in a room, everyone is seeing that IEP that follows them. I also have empathy for the teachers, because before they even meet the child, they're focused on meeting the needs more than the child themselves sometimes.
Yeah.
And that changes the dynamic.
It does. Look, let's get into your area of expertise, and I do consider you an expert, Beth. Let's get into that in a second. But just to wrap up this journey that's taken you from the Chicago suburbs to here. I mean, obviously, we mentioned that you worked with kids who were blind and visually impaired, which must have been extraordinarily challenging, but I presume extraordinarily rewarding at the same time. And then you take the leap to consulting. And I know you have views about consulting and education. Oh. But before you get to that, I mean, tell us just that experience of working with kids with that very specific need about visual impairment.
Well, there's lots of different ways of looking at it. I would say I love a challenge. And I really believe that learners with low incidence disabilities are in many ways, just the pioneers. And they're those young people that were, clearly on the margins from the get-go when it comes to general classrooms. And so to partner with teachers who are very well-intentioned, but completely frightened.
Yeah.
You know, and to be able to really, truly collaborate for the sake of learners in that way, it was, yes, definitely rewarding. But some of the hardest lessons I learned as an educator were through those collaborative relationships, knowing that it wasn't about me being full of self-righteous indignation as an advocate, but knowing that the art of diplomacy and having empathy for the apprehension and the fear of the teachers really meant that some of those relationships that I fostered during those years became a blueprint for what I aspired to with every teacher I worked with after that.
So was that in a school that was dedicated for kids who are blind or visually impaired, or was it kids within I don't want to say mainstream, but a traditional school setting?
That's a good question. Yeah. Actually, there are those schools in the U.S. still. Pretty much every state in the United States has a school for the blind. And oftentimes when children are without warning, sent into a state of low vision, or they become blind as a result of an accident, or sadly because of sickness, they are sent for like intensive remediation to these schools. And then, of course, you've got a lot of students who live in rural areas where they can't receive services. But so I did do some student teaching in a school for the blind in Washington State. And I had really close ties when I lived in Austin, Texas, to the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. But my positions were actually as an itinerant in school districts. So I would have a caseload, and I would spend a lot of time in my car driving from school to school to school and working with these different learners, young and old. I also went into homes because I was certified to teach students as young as 6 months, which were wonderful experiences, watching a child who's blind learn about the world around them through touch and through sound. And I also worked with families of children who were about to age out of the system. And, you know, around the ages of 20 to 21, when it was time to let go of the cocoon, right, that school becomes for these families. So, yeah, it was a really varied professional life that I had.
What did you learn? What did I learn?
Oh, gosh. Looking back, I wish I would have stood still a bit longer to take a look around and to see what an advanced and challenging situation I was in, but it was my normal. I learned in retrospect that I can't do it alone. And I am so grateful for the patience that I had. One of the things you have to be really conscientious about when you're working with kids who are blind is that, you know, chatter and white noise is a true distraction.
Yep.
So you really have to respect people's auditory space. So I definitely think in many ways I became a much better listener. I also, over time, realized that I was a cog. I was part of a system that was much larger than me. And even if I could expend a lot of energy, you know, talking about the shoulds, how it should be working and what would really make sense and why this is a waste of my time and your time, etc. I mean, in the end, that was energy wasted because all teaching is about connection and relationships. And looking back, I think that I was probably a little bit too focused on my ideals. And when I think back to the lessons that I really learned, they were about leaning on each other and the spirit of collaboration when it comes to all teaching, but especially students who have very unique learning profiles.
And now you're a consultant. So now you travel the world being wise with all these lessons that you've learned.
You keep slipping these words into the conversation, Rob. So expert, now it's wise.
Yeah, well,
I'm not sure about that.
Well, I think that's why you're here. So being a consultant is obviously an entirely different way of living and working. Yeah. And how is it?
Well, that's a good question. I think first and foremost, I feel really honored to be invited into schools. And I would say, I'm lucky enough to be, to have a family and to be anchored by, my family and to know that I always have to come home or I always want, of course, to come home and to be with them. If I didn't have that, it would be quite a lonely life, I would say. So that's one piece. I always aspired to be a business owner. I'm quite interested in systems and just organizational psychology and all of the good stuff that goes into being your own boss and really making time and energy and space work for you as a business owner. So that I really relished. I really enjoyed a lot of the interactions and opportunities. But I have to say, being a consultant, I get a little nervous and uncomfortable sometimes when people are like, you're a consultant. I think there's this assumption that consultants are kind of opportunistic and they're kind of cultivating need in order to expand their market. I think that's true quite often. I think in the world of international education, I'm just going to call out the English Schools Foundation as a perfect example. The institutional knowledge and expertise that most schools have in-house is phenomenal. And it's how to surface that and really operationalize those natural leaders within learning organizations to bring them forward as learning leaders that's really the key. So when I go into schools, I always really anchor myself in the idea of making myself redundant, hopefully as quickly as possible, although I love to get invited back. Consultants are from the outside. And when we come into a school or a learning organization, it's not about creating need so that we get another invite. It's really about taking a very close look at who's there and figuring out how we can amplify and augment all that expertise and knowledge, and then figuring out how we can slip out the back door. Because we want them also to own the knowledge and the tools that we come with in our big suitcases.
I think that's such a honest and interesting analysis of how that works, because you are being invited because you have a point of view, you have something to say, but and that's built upon many years of experience of doing what you do. But all systems and bureaucracies are different, aren't they? So I suppose the power of a good consultant is somebody that can come in and very quickly look and see, I can help you make this work, as opposed to, I have this PowerPoint, there you go. It's about how do you make this land? How do you make this work? How do you operationalize things?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have to say, there's consultants that have been doing this for decades and have longstanding relationships with organizations and schools, and I admire that. I'm definitely not putting that down at all. The average school or organization implementation science tells us needs to be concentrated and dedicated to the implementation of UDL for at least 3 to 5 years to really see a significant change in mindsets and practice. And that's a long time. Yeah. So at the forefront is always finding ways to balance truth and care in that relationship building. And, at the forefront of my mind thinking, okay, it's not about when I'm here, it's about making sure that how I'm creating the conditions for, this particular learner or these teachers to really sustain after I leave is paramount.
Let's talk a little bit about UDL. And one of the good things about doing this is I get to quote things back to people who've actually said it. And one of the things, again, that you've written is that you said that we need to challenge the influence of the mythical average learner. Now, you hinted at this earlier on. What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't own that quote. I just want to be really clear. I have to hand that one over to all of the experts and wise voices at the CAST organization. The average learner is something also Todd Rose has done a wonderful job of writing about, and several other experts. And boy, we don't see it, but it's really guiding a lot of our practice. When we're thinking about the learners in our classrooms and how we're seeing them as unique individuals on some days, and then perhaps when we're at the kitchen table trying to think about the planning, right? The designing of the learning for the week, we're seeing them as a collection. And I think that when we don't take a closer look at how standardizing experiences for learners is influencing the way that they're learning, we're really missing out, because the mythical average learner is a huge influence. A lot of teachers, for better or for worse, are doing the very best that they can. But at the end of the day, they're really quite often, sorry about the sports metaphor, but they're pitching to the metal, And then what happens then is when they're in the classroom, they're reacting to those learners who maybe on that day, or maybe the majority of days, actually are outside of that middle part of that bell curve.
I mean, I think back to my own education, which was many years ago, but you did get the sense then that that's exactly how schools were set up. Teachers have always been wonderful, and we all know the most wonderful people who had the great impact on our lives. But schools, the way in which learning and education was delivered, I think, was absolutely back then geared towards, is there a median child, and let's aim everything absolutely at that person. But things have changed. Things have changed, surely.
Yeah, I agree there, Rob, because I think it's really dangerous to use presentism to judge the past. There's a lot of benefits to standardization, even in the world of education. It allowed many countries and regions to actually deliver a slightly above mediocre standard of education for more learners. So choosing to standardize curriculum and standardize approaches served a purpose. And we're in a different time, and we're in a different place. And our aspirations for our learners are so different than they were before.
Yeah. I mean, our boss always says, and I've heard it say it so many times, and it's just so right, which is we don't teach a curriculum, we teach children.
Absolutely.
And that's it, right? That's what we're talking about here. I mean, thinking about UDL, and look, people who are listening or watching this will undoubtedly know what it is. But what is it? What is it? If you were to describe it, if you were to, a new teacher or somebody that didn't know what we were talking about here, how are we describing this?
I might spend a lot of time describing what it's not.
Well, tell us that.
So, okay, sure. Well, pretty much any educator can recognize and name examples of differentiation. And certainly differentiation is a close cousin in many ways. But you might have a very similar strategy, and you might be reaching into your differentiation toolbox. And as that instructional leader in the classroom, you're making that unilateral decision about how to use that strategy or that differentiation tool. You're doing that because, of course, you're a caring educator and you want to work to reduce a barrier for a group of learners or an individual learner. But oftentimes differentiation happens on the fly, and it happens with a reactionary stance. Oftentimes it happens just as I described, which is the person who's making the decisions is the teacher. And so the goal of UDL is not UDL. The goal of UDL is learner agency. So that same strategy or tool, looking at that possibility through the lens of UDL, might be presented to the entire class as an option for them to access in a way that makes sense for them. So choice is not just about making things full of variety. It's really about intentionally designing learning so that support is not a liability. Teachers are not positioned to rescue, and that we're centering the learner and always thinking about how we can design experiences that are optimizing their competency and their autonomy.
I saw, and you'll recognize this, I'm sure, and the name of the person who was in this video has gone completely out of my head, but she described the difference between UDL and differentiation in terms of a dinner party, preparing for a dinner party. You know, rather than preparing a different meal for every single guest, which would be differentiation, I'm guessing.
Yes.
It was preparing a buffet that people could then choose from, and that would allow people to have agency, to not feel as if they were being pegged on. Is that? Am I being right? Is that accurate?
Well, there's many ways of wrapping your brain around UDL, and certainly metaphor is an important part of the making sense process. I think it's always important to elevate this topic of choice to a higher level, and thinking about how choice in our classrooms is used for the express purpose of optimizing competency and autonomy, right? So we want to make sure that there isn't just a variety of flavors, colors, and choices of meats and pasta, but we want to make sure that I'm going to stop the metaphor now. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well,
I don't know
the dinner party is over. Let's bring it back to the classroom.
Nice, Rob. Yeah. All right. So on to dessert. Okay. So getting back to this idea of competency and autonomy, we want to make sure that students are also getting the proper guidance to think more deeply and reflect on why they're making the choices that they are, so that they can carry that as future learning forward and really develop a better understanding of how they learn best. And I think that's really an important piece that oftentimes gets lost in the natural magical chaos and busyness of the classrooms. The feedback and the opportunities for meaningful reflection that teachers can facilitate with the learners in their care cannot be undersold. It is really, truly the magic of building cultures that are really engineered to optimize learner agency.
I mean, there's been lots of debates, particularly recently, I suppose, about personalization of learning and the role that technology can play in that. Now, you have a bit of a step on this because of the work that you've been doing, and I hope I'm going to say this right, about LUDIA.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that work, because it's fascinating and award-winning, I believe.
Indeed, yeah. I was really honored to, alongside LUDIA's co-creator Jeremy Roston, to be presented with the Cast and Meyer UDL Design Award in July. It was pretty exciting. But yeah, just to get back to your question, which is, oh, wait a second. Rob, can you remind me? I'm just reminiscing about that moment.
This thing that you have built. This thing called LUDIA.
Thank you. LUDIA is actually the product of a passion project that I started shortly after ChatGPT was launched. And I had this vision, and that vision was of leveraging ChatGPT by creating scripts that any teacher could use to elicit UDL-informed responses from ChatGPT. And the reason why I was so interested in doing this is because Universal Design for Learning is 40 years old. And there's a lot of layers to it. And oftentimes you'll have conversations with teachers and they're like, oh, it sounds great. It's a great idea. And oh, yes, UDL, I'm doing that. But what you often see in practice is that the cognitive overload that can easily be triggered, right, when looking at the actual framework.
Absolutely.
And the guidelines. And then there's, of course, 36 considerations within each of those 9 guidelines. It's a lot. It's a lot for us to manage, especially when, we have a lot of competing demands as teachers. And so I wanted to lighten the cognitive load by creating these scripts. And by the way, this was before prompting was a word in everyone's minds. And I do want to be clear, I failed miserably. It wasn't something that worked well. And so I reached out to a wonderful educator who is clearly an AI enthusiast in the world of international ed, Jeremy Rostan, who at the time I cold called him. I didn't know him, and he was very polite, but very put off. Like, well, what do you mean? But I just knew based on the writing and things that he had produced that he was the person that was right for this collaboration. And yeah, over the course of a couple of years, we took that idea and together, we couldn't have done it alone, but together we actually designed a chatbot, which is named LUDIA, which is the acronym UDL and AI mixed up. Yeah.
You've answered my next question, but there you go. I was going to ask, what is LUDIA? But go, keep on telling us. Tell us about it.
I mean, full disclosure, LUDIA right now is homed on the platform for open exploration, which by many people's standards is a bit of a clunky platform. And we acknowledge that. And it's certainly, there's some pretty significant issues when it comes to digital accessibility on the PO platform. And we cannot forget privacy. Yeah. Right. So it's not there. It's not there yet in terms of being a place that we can send people to, and schools can also give the green light in all places. And for that reason, and now because technology has finally caught up, we are in the process of moving LUDIA over to an independent site of LUDIA's own. And we're really excited. We're working with a wonderful software developer that is really helping us to achieve our goal, which has never changed. We believe, first and foremost, that as international educators, we have a responsibility to be at the forefront of leveraging EdTech, particularly artificial intelligence, to support our community in reducing barriers for all learners. We also believe, and this is the goal of LUDIA, that universal access to universal design for learning is worth pursuing as a goal.
Yeah.
And we really believe that because we all know that inclusive education is a human right. So one of the agreements that we had when we started our partnership with LUDIA was that we would never paywall LUDIA. And we would always aspire to keep LUDIA as accessible as possible. And for that reason, after meeting Jeremy, actually for the first time, we've been collaborating for a couple of years on LUDIA. And we've been fortunate enough to do lots of webinars and a few podcasts as well together, but only virtually. We accepted this award and we were really clear about our intentions in our speech. And that is that in 2025, the world of education has to move away from an over-reliance, and I would say a blind over-reliance on EdTech. We need to move away from an anticipation or expectation that grants are going to fall out of the sky and move the needle, when it comes to inclusive education. We see that, with the stroke of a pen, things disappear. And so the goal is to really tap into our goodwill, but more so our collective intelligence as a community and design tools that set the standard for inclusive education.
Yeah.
So we're really excited about keeping LUDIA paywall free, first and foremost.
I mean, I completely agree with what you said there. I mean, we're at the beginning of this, right?
Yeah.
So we have to have the courage to try things. We have to have the courage to fail. It's one of the things we talk to our students about.
Absolutely.
So we need to be, I suppose, courageous in the ideas that we're willing to prosecute and the things that we're willing to do when it comes to technology. I mean, this is something that's very clearly designed for teachers to use in the classroom.
Well, actually, it's designed to be a thought partner. So not to take the place of a teacher, but to act as a guide to respond in UDL-informed ways, to gently redirect your mindsets towards this true belief, which is the barrier to learning is not in the learners. It's in the design of the learning and the learning environments.
How have teachers reacted to it?
Oh, well, gosh, Rob, we're happy to say we have more users than ever. It's a small but mighty monthly usage of about 2,500 educators from actually over 115 countries around the world.
The reason I asked that question is not, to sort of test how popular your app is, but, there is a question, I suppose, of going back to that point about courage, about, teachers having the courage to try new things.
Yes.
To feel comfortable. So there's that aspect. And there's also, I suppose, this notion, and you mentioned it, about, lots of industries are worried about being replaced by technology. And we're very clear here that's not on the cards. But it would be an anxiety, I suppose, if you're a teacher, that you see all of these emergent technologies, all of these emergent services, and you think about your own future within that.
Yeah, I think COVID taught us a lot of really good lessons about the power of connection and how vital relationships are to authentic learning. I think it's, asynchronous learning has its place, and certainly some people really thrive in the virtual space. I definitely believe that there will never be a substitution for that face-to-face connection. And I believe the culture of the classroom is a mainstay. That being said, I think that teaching has never been more complex. And instead of focusing on the possibilities that teachers are going to be replaced, the question that Jeremy and I were pursuing, and we continue to pursue, is how can we build bridges to support teachers? And how can we leverage AI to augment and amplify their expertise?
Yes, 100%.
In really contextually specific ways. And I'm happy to say that's that's the only thing that LUDIA does. LUDIA is very much a one-trick pony. So oftentimes people ask us like, well, does it do this? Does it do that? No, it is just a very finely tuned, well-engineered tool that does one thing well. And we're happy to say that we've received quite a bit of feedback over the years. And our most excited moments are when teachers come up to us and say one of two things. The first is, I use LUDIA all the time, and it has really deepened my understanding of UDL, and it's made me a better teacher. And the next is LUDIA's flexible pathways, because it's designed to have hot linked relevant pathways that you can choose to kind of scaffold your own usage of the tool, has led me down some really terrific rabbit holes where I just never thought about that. But LUDIA put that on the table for me to explore, that barrier that I didn't think about, or, that idea that would have never occurred to me, as far as creating a much more inclusive experience for learners. And Yeah, those are always the most exciting conversations.
I mean, what I love about that is it's such a clear demonstration of the evolution of the debate. I remember when ChatGPT first sort of emerged out of nowhere, it seemed lots of the conversation was about using AI to lift the administrative burden. So to get tasks that are annoying and get AI to do that. And it's so quickly moved on to exactly what you're talking about, Beth, which is how do we harness these technologies to make teachers better, you know, how to amplify the things that they're so great at. And it's so great to see that debate has shifted, because if it's just a tool for lifting admin burden, then that's
we're not fully tapping into it.
No, we're not.
Right.
We're
Definitely. Not. I think, yeah, we're really just at the beginning, but I think that some things will never change. And I think one of the advantages that we can look at too is really embracing time as our most precious and finite resource. So when we introduce tools like LUDIA or other tools that are designed to really amplify the expertise of teachers, we're also giving them more space to pursue their passions in the world of pedagogy, to use their minutes in ways that really increase their own competence and autonomy as practitioners. You know, they're learners as well.
Yeah, I love that, because we talk about creating space and time.
Yes.
Which is exactly what you've said. And I guess the question, the end of that is, you know, for what purpose? And if it's space and time to do more stuff, then that's not a success. If it's space and time to reflect and to develop your own practice, to look at the area that you're talking about, then that's really exciting. Look, we're almost at the end of our time. Where are we going? With all of this, not just the technology, but the development of UDL and inclusive learning and all the things that you're interested in. Where do we go next?
It's interesting that you asked that question, because I was working with such an amazing team of leaders and educators over the past couple of days, and a couple of them have done what I call, they've hit the UDL wall, right? Where they're at a fork in the road. They believe in the mindset, skills, and practices. They're dedicated to learning more, but they're starting to realize that a lot of what they hope and wish for in their practice and in their classrooms is also connected to larger systems at play, that such as the reporting process, or, you can name a bundle of different aspects to any learning organization. And so they're starting to question, okay, well, how far can I go with this if I'm working in a system that isn't quite aligned yet with what I'm trying to accomplish as an instructional leader who's really dedicated to UDL? And I would say here at the English Schools Foundation, what's so exciting is that everyone here is invited to speak truth to power. And so I would say, where do we go next with Universal Design for Learning here at the English Schools Foundation? The sky's the limit. That's sadly not true and not the case in many other organizations. I had the pleasure of meeting with a learner advocate here in Hong Kong who's working to build awareness about neurodiversity here in Hong Kong. And I think right now she was asking me kind of, where do I begin? And she's already an incredibly dedicated and skilled advocate, but with UDL in particular. And I would say that it's always okay to slow down and spend time really digging in to developing a deeper understanding of what the framework can do, both for you and for the learners in your care. So even though I'm tempted, like everyone else, to start imagining a very different future, I actually see that now's the time for us to become really selective about what we want to dedicate ourselves to learning more about, because we're bombarded with so many tidbits of information and knowledge. And I would say right now, looking forward, it's a time for everyone to focus on going deeper instead of going broader when it comes to inclusive learning design.
It's exactly what we say to our students. So, Beth, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm really grateful.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you.